With the constant battle in Congress over debt and taxes, I thought it might be helpful to provide a general overview and maybe a historical perspective on debt and taxes in the United States. I'm not going to claim that either the Democrats or the Republicans have the right answer. Both have some good and yes, even some bad ideas. I just hope that after watching this video, and maybe a few others that I'm working on, you will at least have a better understanding of what they are arguing over, and even if it matters. One of Congress's main jobs each year is to pass a budget for the United States government. While there have been strong partisan disagreements over the U.S. budget in the past, the last 5 years or so have been marked by a particularly strong division between the Democrats and Republicans. Both sides are claiming to be trying to fix the economy, and yet they can't seem to agree on anything. Why is that? Here is a really, really big number, $16 trillion. Unfortunately, that really big number is the amount of public debt the United States had in January of 2013. It grows more than $3 billion every day. Yes, you heard me right. $3 billion every day. Okay, that is a lot of money, and it sounds really scary. The Tea Party and other fiscal-minded people love to throw that number around and come up with things like how many times you could go around the world if you lined up 16 trillion $1 bills end to end. It is a big number. There is no denying that. However, if you look at our country's GDP, it is also a really big number. Whoa, the GPDP, what? Okay, don't stop the video. It's called the annual GDP, or gross domestic product. Now, the annual GDP is essentially what all the goods produced and services in a country is worth for 1 year. One way to think of it might be, what if I summed up the value of everything produced in a country for a year? Every car, hamburger, smartphone design, bridge built, etc. in the entire country for 1 year. Then I added that number to the value of every service performed by people such as doctors, lawyers, teachers, cleaning crews, cashiers, accountants, and etc. The number you end up with is the GDP. A simplified but not completely correct way to think of it might be a country's annual income.
Okay, back to that really big number we saw before. Oh yes, the country's national debt. You might be thinking, thanks a lot, I was trying to forget that number. Hold on. That number also happens to be nearly the same as the United States GDP. So while the US owes a lot of debt, it also generates a lot of money. Does it mean we don't have to worry about our debt? Of course not. But it also isn't the hopeless story that some will try to make it out to be. To understand how we have come to owe so much money, let's look at the United States' history of debt and GDP. In 1792, the U.S. government had a public debt of around $80 million. While $80 million is still a lot of money in today's economy, everyone would be thrilled if the U.S. government only owed $80 million. It doesn't even register on the chart. Yet back in 1792, owing that much debt was a significant problem and burden. The cost of a single stealth plane, about $2 billion, would have swamped the fledgling U.S. government back in 1792. With so much debt, they would have never recovered. So this presents a problem. How do you compare the present with the past when the scale has changed so much? Here's where I will introduce the debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP is simply a comparison between how much public debt the U.S. government has compared to how much money the U.S. generates. It is similar to the debt to income ratio banks use to decide if you qualify for a mortgage loan. Now, let's look at a new graph. Much better. Now, if we look at 1792 again, we can see the U.S. government owed about 35% of its GDP to public debt. Back in those days, credit and money wasn't so easy to get, and was a real burden to the U.S. government. Our current ratio is around 104%, which means the U.S. government owes a little more than its GDP. However, you can see on the graph that we have had an even worse period once before. Really? No one ever mentions that. Many make it sound as if we are on the brink of bankruptcy. As most have already figured out by looking at the timeline, the big spike corresponds with the Great Depression and World War II. Oh, that makes sense. Wars and recessions can make a real impact on our debt to GDP ratio. So, for those who aren't history buffs, let's add a few important historical events, mainly wars and economic depressions. There we are. As you can see, some of the wars caused huge spikes and some did not. Now, because this is a ratio, a spike can be caused by either increased spending or a downturn in the economy and GDP, or even worse, both at the same time. While all the wars had increased spending, some more than others, the largest factor was the GDP. When the economy was allowed to hum along, like the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan wars, the debt to GDP didn't spike as much. When the economy was impacted, or when the economy was already struggling, like right before World War II, the increased spending had a larger impact. This goes to show that the economy can have just as big, or even sometimes an even bigger impact than our spending rate. A good example is, of course, the period after World War II. From 1945 to 1955, our debt actually went up from $260 billion to $274 billion. Wait a minute. So why does the graph show that our debt to GDP plummeted if our debt went up? Well, it's because our spending didn't increase that much, while our economy, which had been stalled for a decade due to the Great Depression, was suddenly given a strong boost by World War II, and quickly went into high gear for many years. Stimulating the economy during the war had a much larger long-term impact than spending cuts would have produced. Remember that point, because I'll come back to it in a minute. All right, I want to shift a moment to that inevitable terror that we all have to face. No, not death, but taxes. Maybe one day science might figure out a way to cheat death, but I doubt science will ever figure out how to help one get out of taxes. As Americans, we like to do a lot of complaining about taxes. I'm pretty sure when a foreigner becomes a U.S. citizen, they have to pledge to complain incessantly about taxes. It's in the Bill of Rights or something like that. Now, despite all our whining, we actually don't have it too bad. Let's put up another graph to show our historical tax rate. Since income taxes are different depending upon your income bracket, and tax brackets have changed a lot over the years, it is really difficult to graph. So I put up the highest tax bracket and the lowest. Obviously, everyone else is somewhere in between the two. Can you say wow for much of the mid-1900s? The highest tax rate was from 70 to 90%. Even the lowest tax bracket paid around 20%. All that complaining by the GOP in December of 2012 was over the highest tax bracket going from 35% to 39%. Seems kind of petty after looking at the historical rates. Not only are tax rates low compared to recent history, but there are a lot of deductions available to almost all taxpayers as well. Reagan is the one mostly responsible for this big shift in tax rates for the top earners during the 1980s. While the bottom tax bracket didn't change much, the top bracket changed dramatically from 70 to 28%. If we compare our tax rate with the rest of the world, look at the green bars on this graph, you will see we have one of the lowest income tax rates in the developed world. The GOP loves to say that raising the taxes on the rich a few percent will cause widespread job losses and a disincentive to work hard and become rich. However, it is pretty clear from our historical tax rate that that idea just doesn't hold water. I certainly don't like the idea of a 90% income tax rate. It just seems wrong. But we didn't suffer widespread job losses from the 1950s through the 1970s, even with an income tax rate at 70% or more for top earners. There was also no shortage of people trying to become billionaires because of it. I'm not going to pretend I know what the perfect tax rate should be for our country, but just remember that in our own recent history and compared to the rest of the world, our taxes are very low. So no more complaining about income taxes, even if it says we should in the Bill of Rights. Now, if you and I are in debt and we want to pay it off, the best thing we can do is buckle down and cut back on spending. Many people ask a completely fair question: why can't the U.S. government just cut back like we have to when we as individuals have too much debt? Unfortunately, it isn't that simple, and I'll give a short analogy to explain why. Let's say you have a small village of about 20 families with a GDP of around $10,000. The previous summer, they had a large feud with the neighboring village and went into a lot of debt to hire soldiers to defend their territory. Because they had spent so much energy defending their territory, their houses, farms, tavern, and mill were in a state of disrepair. Their public debt was around $7,000, giving them a debt-to-GDP ratio of around 70%. Their blacksmith shop was in good order due to the investment they had made to expand the shop during the feud. Several men were lost in the feud, and the village had agreed to support the widows until they could remarry. Spring was just about to start, and there was a large dispute between the village elders on whether they should hold off repairing the houses, tavern, and mill until next year so they could pay off all the debt, or if they should borrow more money and make the repairs now, install an irrigation system, and improve the village market square to attract more vendors. After a long heated debate, the villagers sided with the elders who wanted to cut back and pay off the debt as quickly as possible. It just made more sense and less risky than going into even more debt. So they all agreed to contribute more and put off expenses until another year or so. Everyone pulled together and cut back. At first, things seemed to be going well. However, the local tavern had to release his barmaids because everyone had cut back on eating out and drinking with friends. Then the tavern started to lose its reputation because the roof leaked and its rooms were rent. Less and less folks stopped overnight, which made life very difficult for the tavern owner. The blacksmith shop was in great shape, but unfortunately, no one needed swords or armor anymore. With little business, the blacksmith had to let go 2 of his 3 apprentices. That year, the village suffered a slight drought, so they even had less surplus food than usual to sell at the neighboring markets for cash. Plus, they had to donate to the widows so they wouldn't starve. The mill couldn't grind as much grain since the water wheel was damaged and repairs were put off. Neighboring villages stopped coming to the mill for their services since it took so long. Vendors stopped coming to the market because few could afford their goods. Towards the end of the summer, the blacksmith left to set up at a neighboring village because they had offered him a place to set up shop for free if he would move there. Now the villagers had to travel 2 to 3 hours each way to a neighboring blacksmith shop. That winter was tough because few were able to repair their houses and the cold was coming in. Some even died since it required so much more wood to heat their houses, and some widows and children ran out of wood before the end of the winter. It was a tough year, but they pulled together and paid off half of their debt. However, their GDP was now only $6,000. With the debt paid down to $3,500, their debt to GDP ratio was now only 58%. They felt they had done the right thing. Unfortunately, the elders had informed the village that it would probably take another 2 years to pay off the debt since the village GDP had decreased by so much. Okay, let's step back 1 year and try a different outcome. Back to the village council after their feud. The villagers are convinced to take a risk instead of paying off the debt as fast as they can. The village borrows even more money for community development. Some are really unhappy about this, but they go along with the majority. Since the feud is over, there are now several unemployed soldiers. They are immediately put to work building an irrigation system, fixing village houses, and repairing the mill. Since the soldiers have little to do after hours but hang around, they spend most of their income at the local tavern. The extra income allows the tavern to make repairs, increase the size of its main room, and even add a few guest rooms. The area suffered a small drought, and since it took half the summer to build the new irrigation system, they still suffered a slight decrease in harvest, but not much. And the following years will probably result in a consistent strong harvest due to the new irrigation system, even when there are droughts. The village laid down paving stones in their market square to reduce the amount of mud and dirt. The village also got rid of the fee for new vendors to entice new businesses. The village became well known for the good selection of vendors and a great tavern. The local blacksmith was no longer selling swords, but the foot traffic was so much greater, business was doing okay. To further expand, the local blacksmith sent his longtime apprentice to a distant silversmith for the summer so he could expand into the more profitable business of jewelry and fine tableware in the future. With the increased traffic, more and more neighboring villagers were coming to their village to sell their excess food and use their mill. Since the mill was community-owned, it generated a lot of revenue for the community. The locals no longer had to commute to neighboring markets to buy and sell, since their own marketplace was doing so well. During the winter months, many had little to do since farming was no longer an option, so they spent many of their evenings at the local tavern enjoying their time with their extra pocket money they had. The next spring, the village elders reported despite a record year in revenue, the extra investment had cost them quite a bit of money. Their total public debt was now at $12,000. While their GDP had gone to $22,000, giving them a debt-to-GDP ratio of 55%. Some were angry because their debt had skyrocketed, while others were happy since everyone was doing well and unemployment had all but disappeared, and next year was probably going to be even better than the last. So, let me ask you the obvious question. Which scenario would you want to be in? I'm certainly not advocating for going into more debt whenever the choice is given. Also, I'll admit the analogy I gave is simplistic compared to the complexities of a modern government. It does demonstrate the rationale to increase spending during a depressed economy, though. I intend to go into greater detail in a future video as to why some types of spending in this situation are a bad idea, and other types of spending can be positive. In the first scenario, they paid down their debt but destroyed their economy in the process. When an individual decides to cut back to pay off debt, their income stays the same, since their job doesn't change. This allows them to pay off debt, but still maintain their income, and probably even get a raise each year. After the debt is paid off, the individual can go back to their old spending habits or save money for the future. However, when a government scales back in investments and expenditures, it can have a devastating impact on the economy. This is essentially the fight in Europe right now between Greece and Germany. Greece's economy is struggling with sky-high unemployment rates and a depressed economy. The Germans, who hold most of the debt, are demanding more and more cutbacks in government spending with higher taxes. Who is right? Should they let the Greek government borrow more and more money to stimulate their economy, which will push their debt higher and higher? Or should they have them cut back on expenditures, making the economy worse? There just isn't a simple solution. The U.S. economy as of January 2013 is just starting to show good signs of picking up steam. Making severe budget cuts at this time might actually stall our recovering economy, which leads to lower tax revenue, which means little to no improvement on the debt issues despite the cutbacks. However, increasing our spending on things that will generate no income, such as entitlements, only make our situation worse. Both sides of the debate only see their side of the story and refuse to compromise on a reasonable solution. If you look at our own history, there are very few years when the U.S. government actually lowered its total debt. So scenario 2 has been taken more often than not by the U.S. government over the past 100 years. Now back to the debt to GDP graph. As you can see, there are times in history, wars and recession, that require the government to step in and help out. Our recent history with 9/11 and the near collapse of the financial banking system and auto manufacturing in 2008 should be a stark enough reminder that tough times will come suddenly and unexpectedly. The government needs to help stabilize the economy at times, and unfortunately, that requires a lot of money. So the moral of the story is, we as Americans need to balance our budget and move our debt to GDP down during good times so we have a buffer during the hard times. Of course, that is easier said than done, as the vitriol budget fights in Congress show. Well, thanks for listening, and if you like this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. I plan on doing some more videos on unemployment and jobs, economic stimuluses, and a little more in-depth discussion surrounding the politics of debt and taxes. I will post links to those videos here after I put them up, but if you have any other ideas on videos, hey, leave some comments below.